intermedia and virtual reality artist, writer, and performer based in the SF Bay Area. Inspired by ecology, the sciences, and cinema, she is building immersive experiences in virtual reality. A regularly featured artist on Hollywood's front page, her work blends themes of sci-fi, mysticism, surrealism, into a potent invitation into another dimension. And we've gotten to see some of her stuff. You got to see it back there. It's really amazing. So please join me in welcoming Sara.
Hey, everybody. So thank you for joining me. Just a quick reference, this is not really like a traditional PowerPoint. It's more of just a video that gives reference to some of the works that I'll be talking about in my piece. But I feel like I could write a whole class series on this, so bear with me. It's going to be fast, a little bit heady, and sort of a teaser for you to do your own research if it compels you. But it's also going to be a little bit academic as well as anecdotal. In a way, we're all currently inhabiting our realities as a sort of story, and the lines between worlds of what was formerly cinema and video games into VR, we often focus on how do we suspend the disbelief. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe we should just stop trying. Metafiction is a really interesting way of doing this in the sense that it draws attention to the fact that you're being told a story. You can completely subvert the problem of suspension and disbelief by drawing awareness to the fact that you're in a simulation, much the same way that books and cinema have for a long time. Let's see. In virtual reality, you can do this as a story within a story, a simulation with a simulation, or a dream within a dream, if you will. Every consecutive layer of media that we create can tap into the previous meta-medium, as in a meta-story or a meta-novel, meta-cinema, or even the adaptation of a novel. Whereas 2D things like video games and movies symbolically brought us into the action with mirror neurons, being immersed in the story brings us into the fold in a new way beyond sheer symbolism and actually tapping into our nervous systems and asking us to engage in the plot itself. No longer passive, it engages muscle memory as well as our reflexes and our sense of being in time, instead of a passive boat ride at the behest of the director's pace. In that way, the participant and the audience becomes, in a way, their own co-director. That engagement of the nervous system also allows us to wrap the perception of time subjectively. When people are looking forward to something, it seems to stretch out, but when they're not looking forward to something, it tends to rush right up to us. From screens and buttons being symbolic of action in games to muscle memory, immersion in VR is a new frontier for psychology. It'll shape the way our socializations in the future play out. Our real-time reprogramming of tools in the digital world will create a feedback loop in which the things we change about our virtual worlds will change how our brains adapt to the real world, as well as the worlds that we create. Soon after social media took off, fake accounts obviously became a reality. What began as lifted photos and rudimentary profiles, catfishes and bots, conceptually grew to become a new generation of sophisticated virtual beings that quickly became a part of campaigns for companies, as well as communities and artist collectives. The meta character of a virtual being's reputation is much more easy for corporate entities to destroy for dramatic storytelling effect, and it doesn't have real-world consequences on a living person. It also makes it much easier to control the behavior of the talent, and in this way we might find that virtual beings become more common than real-world talent in the future. The world over is already being swept up in the fictional dramas of their favorite characters. Even when they're not watching the show, people will often follow the virtual accounts of the characters in the show as they interact with their real-world lives. One of the most common comments seen on the latest sensation in virtual beings, Lil Michaela, her Instagram, the most common comment is, "Are you a robot?" This question often comes from young people who might not have a tuned frame of reference for how to spot fakes as easily. Having only come into awareness in the past few years, their brain's own facial recognition software is thrown off in its ability to spot the uncanny valley, because everyone on Snapchat and Instagram is overly filtered. In a way, they've become desensitized to it in media and struggled to make the call for themselves. So as the lines between our media and our real lives blur, how the hell did we get here? Is there any rhyme or reason to how any of this works? Understanding the mechanics of metafiction can help give us some insights to that. And how we apply these new avenues of metafictional devices will also make sense of how stories operate in the new medium. Let's see, so let's go into just a quick definition of what metafiction is. So metafiction is when the author self-consciously alludes to the artificiality or literariness of a work by parroting and departing from novelistic conventions, especially naturalism in traditional narrative techniques. Often referring to stories that are self-aware, the characters within the stories know they're in a story, and it extends to stories that blur the boundaries between what's real and the narrative world. So there are a lot of examples of it in classical literature, everything from Homer's The Odyssey to Canterbury Tales, Hamlet, and Don Quixote. And some of the particular devices employed in metafiction include, as I said before, stories about stories, stories within stories, addressing the audience or reader in cinema. The equivalent of this narration is directed towards the audience. You would call that spiking the camera in cinema. You also see cameos as a way of blurring the bounds between real life and the story. And stories that bring the story out into the real world. There'll be several examples in the video. You can, go watch them if they seem intriguing to you once you go home. So one of the most interesting devices for me personally in metafiction is the fiction suit. And this is a device employed by different authors such as Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, as well as Philip K. Dick in his work Valis, and Grant Morrison in his work The Invisibles. In Slaughterhouse-Five, Valis, and The Invisibles, the stories are able to express a mystical experience that is so outside the normal psychology that if you were to try to describe them in one's personal life candidly, it would sound crazy. In his 25th anniversary edition of Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut in his intro says, quoting Stephen Hawking, he found it tantalizing that we could not remember the future, but remembering the future is child's play for me now. I know what will become of my helpless, trusting babies because they are grown-ups now. I know how my closest friends will end up because so many of them are retired or dead now. To Stephen Hawking and all the others younger than myself, I say, be patient. Your future will come to you and lie down at your feet like a dog who knows and likes you no matter what you are. Vonnegut's explorations of time through encountering the aliens, Tralfamadorians, are unique and mind-bending. Their perception of humanity outside of time, offering the protagonist, offering the protagonist a way to experience the totality of his whole life while still being embedded within it. There's also the idea explored in other metafictions, such as The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which I highly recommend personally. It was adapted into the film The Arrival. So regarding his own inspiration for The Invisibles, Grant Morrison would say, it was an attempt to explain how I was abducted by aliens in Kathmandu in 1994. And if you were to ask him how or why that came about, he would tell you he went to Kathmandu to be abducted by aliens in 1994. The Invisibles is arguably the inspiration behind the Wachowskis' The Matrix. If you don't believe me, go read it yourself. It's totally uncanny. And as he wrote The Invisibles, a really interesting thing happened to Grant Morrison. He employed the fiction suit with his character King Mob, and he found himself manifesting and subsequently experiencing the things that he put his character through in one of the more brutal chapters of The Invisibles. He describes his graphic novel as a form of a hypersigil. I'll touch more on what a hypersigil is later. In Valis, Philip K. Dick creates an autobiographical account of what he dubbed the fiction suit, that's where the name comes from, to describe his experience of having had a pink laser beam of information-rich knowledge that he called the Logos, having hit him in his third eye and imparting a download outside of time. He would spend the rest of his life trying to digest this experience in a personal exegesis, he wrote. So I wanted to make another interesting note about The Invisibles in particular for the sake of the current medium that we're exploring. As you saw earlier in the video, there's a red-headed character sort of in a VR suit. So in The Invisibles, Grant Morrison deployed two fiction suits, King Mob, as I mentioned before, and this other character named Ragged Robin. Towards the end of the series, it's revealed that Ragged Robin is a sort of cyber-linguistic, virtual reality, time-traveling witch, in which she is a fiction suit for Grant and draws direct attention to the fact that it's her own memory of the past and her traveling back in time that influences the outcome of the story that she is writing, The Invisibles. Now, I personally read The Invisibles when I was 19. This came after a multi-year binge of Sailor Moon as a teenager, in which I desperately wanted to be Sailor Moon and save the day. I even named my cat Luna. Little did I know that years later I would accidentally become uncannily close to another protagonist I was deeply imprinted by, namely Ragged Robin, as she began writing her own story narrative in VR. In the 2013 film The Congress with Robin Wright, it features many layers of these metafictional devices, and that's the reason why I want to use this as sort of my wrap-up example. It's quite amazing. In The Congress, you have Robin Wright playing herself, and if you're familiar with her work, she also appeared in The Princess Bride. And so you have not only a cameo, but a reference to another metafictional work, which was adapted from a book, which was also metafictional. It was a book about a book. So in The Congress, we find that it depicts an incredible simulated reality. It's very hard for me to wrap my head around. It's not only a technological augmented reality, but it's pharmacological augmented reality. So you have multiple layers of the mind being affected. It's kind of like if you were to mix The Matrix with Looney Tunes. It's pretty amazing. So it does this through a multi-layered ride of this augmented reality, and ultimately it's about the nature of the movie studio and the breakdown of duality. It stacks these multiple levels of mechanics, the cameo, the story within the story, and the disillusion of the corporation and state, and the subjectivity of dreams into a psychedelic and surreal soup about what means most to us in life, who we connect with, and ultimately the value and the sanctity of our identities in a world that often wants to groom us into escaping ourselves. As an interesting side note, oftentimes when artists are drawing faces, they find that they make the same expressions as their subjects, and it engages a sort of mirror neurons, and they find that their illustration better represents the emotion that they're looking for if you make the same faces. In The Congress, the man responsible for animating the virtual scan of Robin Wright ends up falling in love with her, as she was not acting when her scan was being taken. Little does the animator know that she was actually having her true soul laid out by a brutal revelation of her exploitation by her agent, as she was asked to sign away her identity for a virtual scan. As she's given away her quintessence to the movie studio, Miramount, this is slightly out of order, sorry folks. She finds that she's stuck in a world where she's unable to connect to her family. Her son has a neurological disease that's going to be making him both blind as well as deaf. And so she signed away her identity as a way to be able to reach him in the future, because that technology would be the only way for him to experience the world. And so in this pharmacological augmented reality, you find characters dealing with the transcendence of self. And in a way, they're losing themselves in order to stay connected with one another. And I find a lot of hallmarks with our own reality heading in that direction. So metafiction is a way of inviting the audience to realize that they are writers of their own reality. And this dovetails with a lot of the mechanics that you see in Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, as his fiction suits are a part of himself. The same way when you enter the story, you become a co-director to your own reality, and it invites you to take that same perspective outside of the headset. So rather than trying to find a way to suspend disillusion with your audience, invite them to write the story with you so they can in turn write their own reality when they take the headset off. Yeah, that's about it for my little talk there.